Welcome to MCN, and a bike I really wish I was actually standing next to, Suzuki's GSX-R750. Now the 750 is one of MCN's favourite sports bike. Actually, it's probably my favourite sports bike, and the reason, even by today's standards, even with all those lovely super bikes and super sport bikes you can buy, the reason is that it just captures the absolute essence of sports riding. It's got all the excitement of a Super Sport 600, the revvy nature, the agile steering, the lightness, and it mixes that with kind of the performance of a super bike. From A to B, a GSX-R750 is every bit as fast as a super bike, even on track in most people's hands. But unlike a super bike, it's not hard to ride. It flatters you. It's got just the right amount of power, something like 148 bhp, very light as I say, and it doesn't eat tyres, it doesn't tire you out. And the best thing about the Suzuki was it was always very affordable. And you know, today when you've got super bikes costing way in excess of £20,000, super sport 600s have disappeared, that old GSX-R750, I just wish they still made it. When in actual fact they do, because in America you can still buy the GSX-R750. It's $12,500, which in UK is £10,500, which is an absolute steal. Why Suzuki don't just bring a few of those over to the UK, I don't know. But in any event, the GSX-R's gone. So what is going to take its place? Well, I know what you're saying. It's the Ducati Panigale V2. And here it is. Is this the spiritual successor to the GSX-R750? Well, in a lot of ways, yes. The baby Ducati superbike has been around since the old Ducati 748, then it evolved into the 848, and we know the journey. And it's ended up with this V2. This V2 replaces the old Panigale 959. This came out in 2020. And for anyone really in the know who's ridden the smaller superbikes and the big superbikes, they will tell you that the smaller ones are better. Okay, it doesn't have huge power, hasn't kind of got the same kudos, but to actually ride, they're a much nicer thing. They're much more friendly, they're much more involving, a lot lighter, and a lot like the GSX-R750. One thing it isn't is cheap. This is about £16,000, but if you've got that kind of money and you want a really nice sports bike, it does come with a lot of nice stuff. You've got a 955 V-twin engine, which is actually bigger than the engine Foggy used to race in his old 916. It's got 153 bhp, so kind of in the ballpark of the old 750, and lots of nice bits of equipment. It looks just like the V4 Panigale now, same aggressive lines, single-sided swing arm, which the 959 never had. Really aggressive stance. You've got Brembos, you've got fully adjustable suspension, you've got a colour dash, full armoury of lean sensitive electronics. It's a mouth-watering prospect. So what I'm going to do now is take this out on the road and see if it has the spirit of the 750, because one of the reasons the 750 was so good compared to a super sport bike is that it had just that little bit more grunt. That's why people don't buy 600s anymore, because they're sort of perceived as very revvy and very peaky. That's not actually the case, but the perception is there, and that's kind of why they fizzled out, especially as your average sports bike rider is getting a little bit advanced in years, like my good self. So, you know, that's why 600s are gone, and also 600s were quite cramped. GSX-R750 wasn't. It actually had a nice bit of room, and I went touring on one quite a few times. So the idea today is not to race this round the track, because we know it's a fast track bike like 600s were, and we know, you know, this competes in racing. This is in World Super Sport now. It's got special dispensation. There's the V2 Cup at BSB. It's a fantastic track bike, but I want to know if it makes a great road bike like the GSX-R750 was. Right, here we go. Well, it's pretty safe to say that Ducati doesn't feel anything like a GSX-R750 when you first jump on. Obviously it's a twin compared to an inline 4, so it's a little bit clattery, a bit more characterful, a bit more interesting. It's not as easy just to sort of jump on though and just ride smoothly. You kind of got to feel your way into a twin and just understand how it likes to be ridden. You can't have the revs too low, you can't have them too high either, so you kind of just got to have it just right. So your gear selection is quite important. Whereas the GSX-R750, you could almost just select 6th gear as soon as you're rolling, and you could just leave it there. It's got so much grunt. So while we're just steady away here, let's talk about the riding position, because that's what puts off so many people when it comes to a super sport bike. Because the perception is your knees around next to your ears, you're doing a handstand on the bars. The Ducati is very sporty, a fair bit of weight on your wrists, the seat's relatively firm, as it would be because it's a race replica, but it is actually very spacious. So I'm 6 foot tall, with dodgy old knees, and I really like the leg room you've got on the Ducati. It's really nice, and the bars are really nicely splayed, really wide in the kind of modern style. You know, you ride any modern race bike now and you will see that the bars almost look flat like motocross bars, so the riders can get their elbows right bent and leant forward. So comfort wise, the Ducati is really good. Let's talk about the engine. So 955cc twin. It's got a nice rumble to it. In 6th gear at about 4,000 revs, quite low. It's almost on the verge of being clattery, but you open the throttle and you get that really lovely induction growl. This is a lot sportier than a Ducati Supersport 950. That feels a little bit short revving, a bit kind of diesel-y if you like, but this is much longer revving and much more powerful. So at low speed it's really friendly, it's really spacious, and of course you're on a Ducati, it makes you feel really special. You know, your view down to the clocks. It's got quite a nice dash on, but by today's standards it's quite weeny. But everything's just so beautifully put together and beautifully built. You know, the tanks, the paintwork is lovely, and all the bodywork is just a lovely thing. Although these mirror stalks, the amount of mirror stalks I've known break on these bikes because they don't bend and they seem to be made of chalk isn't so good. Apart from that, it's a really lovely thing. It's 16 grand, isn't it? But worth 16 grand. And right here, right now, through these country lanes, you don't need a V4, you don't need the bigger bike. The bigger bike would actually be a little bit more clattery now and a little bit more heavy and a lot more expensive. So this is just such a lovely bike. It has got the spirit of the 750 in terms of how easy it is to ride and how flexible the engine is. So wind the wick up a little bit. It doesn't have Öhlins, it doesn't have electronic suspension. The ride quality is plush, it is controlled. Okay, it's still a little bit stiff because it's a sports bike, and this bike's got a very stiff chassis. It hasn't really got a chassis, it's basically got a cast aluminium airbox, and that's the chassis. The engine hangs from that, the front end bolts to the airbox, the rear end bolts to the engine. So it's a very stiff bike. Its superpower on the track is its braking performance. It's really stable on the brakes, really stable through fast corners. Maybe not as fast steering as a conventional supersport bike, and not really the lightest either, but it's a lovely thing. It's a bit bumpy over the bumps. Gearbox is lovely, quick shifter, the clipper, beautiful, really neutral steering. so easy, just so feel really connected. I love it. Need to use the brakes much so far, but the brakes on Ducatis, even though they've got cornering ABS, they've got loads and loads of feel, and that's missing from most new bikes now. So you've got to tip your hat to Ducati for having such lovely brakes. This flowing country road is utterly delectable. The brush of the brakes, slip into the corner. These tyres, these Rosso Corsa 2s, they've been superseded by 4s now, but they're still fantastic tyres. They're kind of a halfway house between Diablo, Rosso 2s, 3s or 4s. They're halfway house between them and kind of track day tyres, so you could do track days on these no problem. Clutch is really nice and light as well. Brakes are really progressive. It's very hard to find fault. Let's turn this camera around. What made the old GSX-R750 so good was his engine. Inside every great bike is a great engine, and that was flexible. You know, you could ride it slowly, but it also had this real revvy, naughty nature, and this is exactly what Panigale's got. Listen to that duction. Oh, this thing is just amazing. So although this has got a lot of grunt, it's a big V-twin, it likes to be gripped as well. I guarantee this is more fun than a superbike, because all the superbike's good stuff happens at really high speed on the track, whereas here in the Panigale V2 you can enjoy it at more leisurely speeds. Brake for Mr. Postman. So the bike feels a little bit stiff at low speed, but once you start winding up the wick a little bit, it starts to make sense. It floats over the corners. Wow. Oh, it's got a proper bark to it. Oh, beautiful. It just goes exactly where you point it, and the more you push it, the more it digs in and the better it feels. It just really, really flatters you. You don't feel like you're not worthy, like on lots of super bikes. Let's pop through this town. Yeah, once you're going slow again, it starts to feel a bit risky. You need a bit of speed under your chest, a bit of wind to support you, to take the pressure off your arms. So the V2 is perfectly happy just poodling through little villages. It's sensational on country roads. Now we're going to take it to its unnatural habitat, a little bit of motorway. Gear in there somewhere. It's obviously not built for motorways, but if you're going to go on a nice ride somewhere, you're going to encounter boring bits of road. So it's got quite a decent sized screen on this. I can feel a little bit of heat coming out of the exhaust, which wrap right underneath the seat, and I know a lot of people complain about the heat. To be honest, in the UK it's not a problem. You're generally grateful that it's so hot, but I understand that in other countries it's a problem. Right here, right now, it's quite hot in the UK. I can feel it. What this bike needs, I think, if I was riding this hours and hours on end, is cruise control. Just so you can kind of take your right hand off the bar and Give your wrist a little bit of a shake every now and then. It's got a decent amount of grunting top once you're at motorway speeds. You just can't fault it. You definitely don't want anything bigger. It is that kind of perfect balance of nice agile handling, an interesting involving engine, lots of grunt. This thing's fantastic on the track. We did the launch of this at Jerez at the end of 2019 and it was just sensational. You could just ride it all day. I've ridden a couple of V4s, V4S, V4R around Jerez as well. To be honest, after a couple of sessions, your muscles have cried enough. Just the way this thing tips into corners, just rolls in beautifully. There's loads of feedback from the front end. You can take serious liberties on the front end of this bike. It's beautiful. Electronics, yeah, it's got all the lean sensitive aids. I mean, all you're ever really feeling for normal riding is the quick shifter and the auto blipper. I've got it in sport mode just to sharpen up the throttle a little bit. It's got lean sensitive traction control. You're only ever going to feel that on the track unless something goes badly wrong on the road. And the same with the cornering ABS. It's kind of there as a safety measure, not things you really bump into. You can turn the wheelie control off as well, which is good. Although this isn't really a natural born wheelier. You can wheelie it, but it's a little bit aggressive when it comes up. Yeah, this is probably one of the best sports bikes you can buy for the road of any capacity. It's lovely, it's easy. Well, got to say, that was fucking amazing. Excuse my French. Well, there is actually, as well as this, another option if you want that kind of GSX-R750 feel. And of course, that is the MV Agusta F3. This started life as the F3 came out in 2013. And this latest model is the F3RR. So this is £20,000 nearly, almost double the price of a GSX-R750 in America. It's probably closer in spirit to the Suzuki than the Ducati because it looks like a conventional super sport bike, because this came out first in 2012 as a 675 super sport spec, and they enlarged it to 800 in 2013. It's got about 145 bhp, so in the ballpark of the Suzuki, and strangely enough, especially in these colours, this looks a lot like a GSX-R750. If you see this at a distance, it looks just like the Suzuki. It's exotic, you know. Price of sports bikes have gone through the roof now, haven't they? And something like this is the kind of plaything of the well-heeled. But if you can afford it, it's got a lot of nice stuff. Like the Ducati, it's got fully adjustable suspension. It's not Öhlins, but it's still very, very good. You've got Brembos, colour dash, loads of electronics. Both bikes are on the same Pirelli Diablo Rosso Corsa 2 tyres, so very, very nice tyres. It's got a full armoury of lean sensitive electronics. And the thing that makes this the RR is these aerodynamics. So on the front fairing lowers, you've got these carbon fibre strakes which produce 8 kilos of downforce when the bike's flat out at about 140, 150 mile an hour. You've got this exhaust shroud and a front mudguard, a big bulbous front mudguard that looks like it's a refugee from Moto 2. Now, having ridden these bikes before, I know that they're a little bit flawed, or they were a little bit flawed. mainly because of the way the throttle works. The throttle response was always a little bit messy. The engine was always a little bit finicky. But once it's on song, it is pure super sport. And whether it makes a good road bike, well, let's have a look now. Right, here we go with the MV. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with the F3 over the years, over the last 10 years, since the F3RR was launched at Paul Ricard at the beginning of 2012. It was a fantastic bike. The fueling was all over the place, the engine braking was all over the place. And basically it's been something MV have been working on ever since. 2013 I rode the F3 at Misano. Absolutely fantastic. On track, this bike is really, really good. It's also got a counter-rotating crank like a MotoGP bike or like Panigale V2. So the idea of that is because the engine's spinning backwards, it pushes the front wheel down under hard acceleration. It also means that when you tap the throttle in the middle of the corner, the bike kind of keeps to the apex instead of running wide. So compared to the Ducati, this is more like a super sport bike that we sort of know and love. It's a little bit more cramped, although it's not too bad. It's not kind of like ZX10 levels of crampedness. In actual fact, it's more comfortable than a Triumph Speed Triple 1200RR that I've been running as a long-termer, because the bars are closer to you. It's all more kind of a neutral riding position, so it's pretty good in that respect. The thing with MVs that have sold them bikes over the years are two things really. Number one is the noise. This thing sounds spectacular. It's got this really beautiful kind of crunchy engine note at low speed. It's got a lot of induction roar, and it just rasps like a bumblebee on acid at full revs. And the other thing of course is how beautiful it is. I mean, the styling hasn't changed since 2012, and this looks very much like the F4, which has been out since 1998. So this is sort of a bit like Porsche 911 of the bike world. It's real steady evolution rather than big revolution. Because it's a 3-cylinder instead of a twin, it's a little bit smoother at low revs than the Ducati. It's actually really nice. The fueling much better than MVs of old. But I've just noticed a small problem that I remember from when I did a first ride of this. You might have seen the video. It's, oh, listen to that. The brake feel is just really weird. The first bit of the brakes, first grab of the brakes, nothing seems to happen, and the second grab it does. It's really hard to set the span. Weird. The seat's nice and roomy. Got a decent sized screen. The dash is kind of looks like an Italian supercar. Well, just remember the let's have the indicator on for ages. All the idiot lights that go around the dash are really dull for some reason. They've always been like that on MVs. But the main display is quite nice, quite PlayStation-y. Not as many kind of functions as you've got on the Ducati, but you've got Bluetooth connectivity and all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more kind of playful looking, the dash, than the more technical looking dash on the Ducati. Very stable, very solid. I'd say actually, well, the suspension's stiffer than the Ducati, feeling the bumps a bit more. It kind of seems to glide better, and the engine's got such a lovely induction roar. know from experience, having ridden these around the MCN 250, that they get really uncomfortable after a while because the suspension's so stiff. Over the bumps, it can pound your backside after a while, and the bars are still quite low. But it does feel every inch like a conventional super sport bike, but you've got a lot more grunt in top gear now. Really, for swift riding like this, not too manic, more than enough. Oh, glorious. Like the Ducati, it's got a full range of lead sensitive rider aids, none of which you're really going to see in normal riding if you take it to a track. The quick shifter, the flipper, they're really smooth. Controls are a little bit, the clutch is a little bit heavier than the Ducati. Kind of got a little bit more of a solid feel to it, not quite as friendly as the Ducati. Just generally to ride, a little bit more of an acquired taste. And really a mile away from the GSX-R750, which is very soft and very cuddly. And really that's the secret to success, because it's just so easy to ride. Soft bikes are easy bikes. This is a little bit stiff. Ooh. Ooh. The brakes are fantastic, but just don't really know where you are with the lever. A bit disappointing. Whoa. So it's nice and flexible at low speed. Definitely not stable over bumps. Feels like it's on the edge of a tank slapper under hard acceleration. Something you don't really feel on modern bikes anymore. You don't really need steering dampers. This would, if you rode it hard. It's definitely a bit busier. I think the Ducati will pull away from you just because it's not quite planted. It's definitely belonged on the track, on a smooth bit of road. Oh. Lovely. Proper super sport bike. Now while the Ducati just glides along with not much input from the rider. Needs a bit more of your attention. But like anything, what you reap is what you sow. Ultimately, it's more exciting. Wow, fantastic. And this is a bike really to be enjoyed more in small doses than on track. It's more of an intense riding experience, whereas the Ducati, you know, you could just ride that all day slowly and it would still be nice. Whereas this kind of begs you on a little bit like a conventional super sport bike. I think the only thing really spoiling this for me are the brakes. It's a shame. The brakes are such a bugbear on most bikes nowadays. You know, it's the ABS that absolutely kills the feel of most braking systems. You've got brakes that fade, you've got these brakes that feel a bit inconsistent. It's just bizarre. It doesn't have to be like that, never used to be like that. It's because of ABS and lean sensitive ABS now. Just listen to this engine barking all day long. And you can feel this is getting pretty wristy already. Well, I'm only saying that because I'm 52. I don't think I would have even thought twice about a wristy sports bike when I was in my 20s. Didn't even compute. But that's kind of a sign of the times, isn't it? Most riders are older now. If you've got 20 grand burning a hole in your pocket, it's unlikely you're going to be a 19-year-old. So, on the motorway, so one place it scores over the Ducati is that it does have cruise control, although it's a very rudimentary cruise control system. It's literally a button on the right bar that you've got to try and get to whilst holding the throttle. Trying to get it working. Anyway, I've used the cruise on these bikes before. There's a button on, a button off. There's no reset. There's no resume. There's no way to turn it up and down when you're going along. So it's very, very, very basic. But it can be useful if you want to take your hands off the bars and give them a bit of a shake. It's not too buzzy at motorway speeds, but it's kind of on the edge of feeling like it just wants to go. It feels a little bit impatient, whereas the Ducati is a little bit more cruisy. But this is easily the most refined MV they've made so far. They've come a long way with the electronics and the fueling. The engine's had a whole host of upgrades a couple of years ago through Euro 5. Power delivery is nice and linear. It just feels like a race bike on the road. So really this sort of fits into the category of why people just stop buying super sports bikes, because they're just a little bit too highly strung. If you do want something that's pure super sport, just wants to go fast, that just wants to excite you, this is fantastic. Like the Ducati, the wind protection is pretty good. I mean, this is where sports bike scores over an adventure bike or a naked. There's very little wind noise and very little buffeting. If you were to be on a Turismo Veloce, one of these, which is kind of the upright version, you'd be getting a lot more wind noise, a lot more buffeting. But this is nice and quiet. Sports bikes are designed to be aerodynamic, aren't they? This handles beautifully. It rolls into corners. Like the Ducati, it's got lots of grip. Brakes are good when they're in your hand. When you set off on this thing, it does feel quite calm and relaxed and comfortable, and then you have a taste of it, the good stuff, and then when you come back to that slow riding again, that's when you kind of notice that it is quite hard, it's quite uncomfortable, it's quite single-minded. But that engine just makes up for everything, the noise of it. Just beautiful. So the big question is, are these two bikes really the spiritual successors to the Suzuki GSX-R750? Well, I would say hell yes, because they've got the same kind of ability to excite when you're going really fast. They're quite calm when you want to go slowly. The engine's got a lot of grunt. They handle superbly, and really these two bikes are much better than a superbike on the road. You can't use a fraction of what a superbike's capable of on the road, whereas these you can actually dip into their good stuff and just drag out the performance. They're also less highly strung than a conventional super sport bike, so they really do kind of sit in that nice middle ground. In terms of what they're like, they're very, very different. The MV is just like a pure super sport bike, really. The dimensions are very similar, although it's not too uncomfortable even for a taller rider like me. But all it wants to do really is get going. The engine is torquey, but it thrives on revs, and if you're not revving it, it kind of is asking you why you're not revving it. The suspension is okay over bumps, but it just wants a nice bit of smooth tarmac. It loves to lean. The brakes are fantastic, although it's got a really strange brake feel. I don't really understand that. And it sounds amazing as well. So I would say if you just want that kind of, you know, distilled super sport experience, and you just want to go fast, you just want to do track days, the MV is going to be the bike for you. The Ducati, on the other hand, is much more rounded. It does all the things the MV does. It likes to rev. It's very, very fast, but it's just that little bit calmer and a little bit more refined. The suspension's a bit plusher. The engine's kind of longer revving, even though it's a twin compared to the triple. It's just a little bit more relaxed. The riding position is more spacious. There's more leg room, there's more arm room. It feels like a more modern bike. This kind of feels like a 90s supersport bike, really, or a 2000s supersport bike, where this feels kind of bang up to date. This does feel like a baby V4. And again, I'd rather ride this on the road than the big V4, just because you get more out of it. And it's a beautiful thing as well. It's really well finished, and it's a lot cheaper than this. But talking of price, they're still expensive bikes, aren't they? So if you can't afford 16 grand or 19 grand, like I can't, the winner of this test is still the GSX-R750, because even though you can't buy them new, you can pick up a really good one for less than £10,000, way less than £10,000. And then you can put suspension, gearing, tyres, better brakes on it, and you'll have something which is still remarkable by today's standards. But if you want to buy new and you've got the cash, then either of these two bikes are going to make you smile.